Hortenstein, my daughter, and our son Aaron is. Yep. We had a little glitch, so I thought I was too, but it changed.
Okay.
We'll be fine.
Can you put this more in the middle?
Yes. There's torn up pages in this book, words that tell me I'm no good, chapters that define me for so long. But the hands of grace and endless love dusted off and picked me up, told my heart that hope is never gone. God is in this story. God is in the details, even in the broken parts. He holds my heart, He never fails. When I'm at my weakest, I will trust in Jesus. Always in the highs and lows, the one who goes before me. God is in this story.
Storm you're walking through feels like it's too much, and you wonder if He even cares at all. Hold on tight to what you know, promised He won't let you go. A song of healing's written in His scars.
God is in this story. God is in the details, even in the broken parts. He holds my heart, He never fails. When I'm at my weakest, I will trust in Jesus. Always in the highs and lows, the one who goes before me. God is in this story. If it reads like addiction, if it reads like disease, He's the one who frees the prisoner.
He's the healer of all things.
If it reads like depression, if it reads broken home,
He's the one who holds your sorrow.
He won't leave you here alone. God is in this story. God is in the details, even in the broken parts. He holds my heart, He never fails. When I'm at my weakest, I will trust in Jesus. Always in the highs and lows, the one who goes before me. Always in the highs and lows, the one who goes before me. God is in this story.
You're in this story.
God is in my story.
Right here in my story.
Wow. Joni, you have two people in your house that can sing. Probably you can sing too. I think that sounds like something we should make Joni do next time. Sing. Well, thank you all for coming out today and braving the snow. You're already starting off with a good story. Is this okay? Yeah. All right. I have my phone up here so I know, I guess you guys have a clock. The last place I spoke didn't have a clock, so I got about 3/4 of the way in and I had no idea what time it was. So then I just started picking up the pace so fast because I was afraid we were almost out of time, and they were like, man, you were talking fast. So I want to make sure I pay attention to that. So thank you for having me back. We did this, I think, 1 year ago. Was anyone here last year? Yay! Oh, good, you came back. That's a good sign. Now, I was telling another church, I did a women's thing in Napa, California on last Friday night, and then I spoke in their Sunday morning service. So I'm going to tell you what I told those ladies, which is you have to pretend that you're hearing it for the first time, even if you remember me already saying it, right? So if you were here last year, I have to repeat a few things, but not a lot. But just kind of some of my leukemia story I'm going to tell again. So you just smile and nod and pretend that you... Most of us don't remember anything like the next day, so probably I'm flattering myself to think you'll remember what I said a whole year ago, but just smile and nod. So I want to say thank you to this church also, because I've started doing, I call these soul selfie soirees now. So it's an actual 3-hour interactive women's event, and your church is where I started and where I got my footprint for every other session that I do. So you guys set it up last year, however you decided to, where I spoke for a while and we took a break and went next door and had some food, and then we do some interactive parts. And it was so perfect, I just said, that's what I'm doing from now on. So congratulations, you're like the famous church that started it all. So let me see here. I have a lot of notes. Nobody panic when you see my giant book. It's because there's only like 4 words on a page because I can't see anymore. So today we just have a few short hours together. So my goal is to help you get to know me better, get to know each other better, get to know yourselves better, and get to know God better than when you arrived. Then I'm going to give you some tools for you to take home with you so that you can continue on your own what we learned here today. So in order to do this, I'm going to talk nonstop to the point where both you and I are going to want to say to me what my daughter said to me when she was about 3. I had a friend over for coffee, and my sweet little 3-year-old was just playing at our feet, and finally she looked up at me, and apparently I was monopolizing the conversation. So she sweetly looked at me and said, "Stop, Mom, play the quiet game by yourself." And I was like, oh, okay then, little smarty pants. But so by the end, we may want me to just play the quiet game by myself. But in order to get all this in, I'm going to talk. It's going to be like waterboarding or something. But then we're going to take a nice little break, get ourselves some sugar, and take some, snap a few selfies. There's a really neat little selfie station they've created out there. And then we're going to take things to the next level, so no sneaking out. We'll wrap things up in a little bit after that, and I'll have some books out there that you can purchase if you want and get them signed, or get one for a friend if you already have one. I don't think, someone was reminding me that last year I didn't have this book in print yet, so this is a new one. So I have copies of those. So let's pray together and get this party started. God, I know you have a specific word for each woman here today. Help them have ears to hear your voice and respond to your invitation to come close and to lean in and hear what you've invited them to. We pray these things in your name. Amen. You go first. That's what I was taught when I was little, and what most conscientious parents teach their children. And I'd say in most cases, that's the polite and considerate way to live, unless where you're going requires you to be brave. If where we're about to go feels dangerous or threatening, then most of us, though we don't like to admit it, are relieved when we hear somebody say, "I'll go first." Today, I'll go first. I'll kick it off by telling you about some key life circumstances that helped me kick out some character defects that for years prevented me from being willing to go first. So in 2015, as many of you might remember, I was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia. But I remember it like it happened last Thursday. I'd been having symptoms for a few months, and the doctors, for lack of a better explanation, had diagnosed me with rheumatoid arthritis. When I came home from a trip to California seeing my family, where I had hiked with my mom and my sister, I realized something was wrong because I had felt like I was running a marathon. I could go from here to maybe where Joni's sitting, and I'd have to stop and catch my breath and recover. That didn't seem right. Also, when I got home, I had bruises on my forearms just from resting my arm on the armrest on the airplane. So my platelets were completely tanked. So my red blood cells made it so I couldn't breathe. My platelets made it so I had bruises, or my lack of platelets. And because of this, I decided to go get a complete blood count because I'm no doctor, but that did not seem like rheumatoid arthritis to me. I just got my real estate license a couple months before that, and I was at a training on a Friday. I told them as I left that I had to run to the doctor. It was about 11 o'clock. I said, I'll be back in about an hour. I ended up going straight home because I was just out of sheer discouragement and frustration of not being able to figure out what was wrong with me. And I just took a nap. So a few hours later, I woke up. About 4 o'clock, a woman who I assume was an oncologist called me and told me over the phone, here are your blood counts. These are indicative of leukemia. We have a bed for you at the hospital. You need to come here immediately. I called my husband, and we arranged for our kids, who were, I think, 14 and 15 at the time, the two that lived at home, to get to a friend's house. And as we got in the car, I remember asking my husband, how long do you think we're going to be there? And he had already called the doctor and gotten some information that I didn't think to ask when I was kind of in shock when they called me. And he said, 30 days. I said, pardon? And he said, that is the standard treatment for leukemia. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So by 5 o'clock, we were sitting in a hospital bed waiting for me to get hooked up to this contraption that was going to pull all the blood out of my body, clean it, and put it back in my body. It looked like something that you might see in like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. It was this plastic or a kid's science project. It was very remedial looking, and this was going to supposedly save my life. So they pulled all the blood out, put it back in, and I don't know about you, but before leukemia came to my body, I did not know that the acute part of the leukemia means abrupt, brutal, and time sensitive. You do not pass go, you do not collect $200. One of my friends actually, who was in for his second round of chemo when I got there, his name was Lanny. He sadly did not survive, but he got leukemia on Christmas Day. And when you get leukemia on Christmas Day, you go to the hospital on Christmas Day. It's not like some other cancers where they say, well, you know, why don't you come in next week and we'll get your chemo started, or make a plan, tell your work, tell your friends, tell your family. It's once you get that diagnosis, you go straight to the hospital. You don't have any time to waste. In fact, when I got there, I had originally planned to go the following Wednesday to my doctor to get blood work done, and they ended up squeezing me in on Friday because of my heart rate thing. And they said, I told them that when I got to the hospital, and they said, oh, if you wouldn't have come today, you would not have lived till next week. Everything was just rapidly increasing, my white blood cells. So because of the abrupt nature of my cancer, obviously there were calls and texts and emails flooding in, people trying to get answers about what was happening. So my friend and my husband set up a blog for me to update people on the status of my cancer. At one point, I think there were over 20,000 people checking in on that, because pretty much everyone in our family is in ministry. So they all had churches, and some of them work at Christian colleges, so people were checking in and praying and praying and praying. So they even flew my son, Berkeley, home from California. It was his freshman year. They weren't sure that I was going to make it out of ICU. But through much prayer and some sound medical advice from my husband, no, he is not a doctor. Shout out to WebMD, apparently. I was given a shot that, in short, helped me wake up. When I woke up, I couldn't talk, walk, roll over, shower, eat, or do anything by myself. I was 44 years old, went home with a shower chair and a walker. I'd lost all my muscle in my body in those 9 days in ICU. My hair, which had been untouched since I landed in ICU, was just it was this much hair when I went in. When I came out, this was in a big giant dreadlock. So once they started to brush it, it just started coming out. So then we just sheared my head while I laid in bed. So enough of that sad story, because clearly I got better. In fact, let's just pause here for me to tell you one funny story about when I was in ICU. which I bet you didn't even know there was a funny ICU story out there, but mine is good. So I don't remember if I told this last year, but again, just laugh as if it's your first time hearing it. So I still couldn't talk very well, and my family had all gone home. It was the middle of the night. I'd saved up all my morphine because I thought I want a really good night's sleep. So I didn't give myself any all day. So I just saved my pumps for nighttime, just loaded myself up with morphine, which did not help me sleep, by the way. It made me stay awake for the rest of the night. So I was awake watching TV, and I came across a channel, a QVC channel, which I've never in my life ordered anything from. But they were showing this demonstration of this woman putting her makeup on. And by the time I got done watching this, I was like, I have to have that. I would look so beautiful if I had that makeup. And so I called the number and ordered this makeup kit. I had to even pick out a foundation color. I just got out of ICU the day before, and I was on morphine. And I called and ordered it and gave them my credit card from memory. I can't even do that today. So maybe the morphine made me really smart for a little bit or something. Gave them my credit card from memory, my address and everything. And they said, ma'am, you're gonna have to speak up, we can't hear you. I'm like, I know, I have leukemia, I'm in ICU, I'm in the hospital. I feel like they really shouldn't have, allowed me to buy something. That seems irresponsible for them. But I did get the makeup, and it was quite lovely, and I don't think I looked as good as that lady did, but it did come. I was afraid, it didn't come for maybe a month. So I thought, where did I send that? Who knows where I sent that stuff? But I do have it. I'm just still finishing up the last of it, actually. So anyway, I got better enough after I got out of the hospital to go back in the hospital once a month for the next 7 months and stayed there 6 days at a time to get chemo. So I ended up being in there for a total of 70 days and staying in 10 different rooms on the oncology floor. So after I didn't die in the first 30 days I spent in the hospital, the rest of the time was not spent really feeling very sick. But I did have an inordinate amount of time by myself. I continued to update people on my cancer status, but you can only do that for so long. So I started writing about what I observed around me, how what I was going through affected my heart and soul, and what I was learning about God and faith and family and community. And after a while, I would hear comments like, I feel kind of bad because I'm reading a blog about your cancer, but I come away feeling encouraged by it. I was basically just reasoning things out on paper. Often I was talking to myself or God or the reader, whoever that might be. So I don't really believe ultimately that cancer was the only trauma that caused me to have insights about what was going on inside of me. Because of some betrayal and anguish in some key relationships and being affected by the family disease of addiction, I had already been steeped in emotional trauma for the 3 years leading up to my diagnosis. Leukemia was just the proverbial icing on the cake. I think cancer and the 70 days in isolation just gave me the voice and the space and the time to process and learn from and share these stories. And I didn't just tell stories of hope and courage and trust. I told stories about my shortcomings, my failures, and my dark thoughts. I wrote about what I call the common plagues of the heart, such as worry, fear, resentment, comparison, control, just to name a few. I touched on places in my heart that I have come to find out also exist in yours. I used to fear that because I never wrote anything before I had cancer, that when my cancer went into remission, that my writing skills would go into remission with it. But since the diseases of the soul are chronic, I will never run out of material. I'm still soul sick. These plagues will need ongoing attention and tweaking and kicking. I love how Brett, my very super wise sister-in-law, said it. It's like God used cancer to root out a cancer in you that has nothing to do with cancer. Yeah, she's good, right? So as I reflected on what to call my first book, which is a collection of the first 120 blogs I wrote while I was in my cancer battle, I asked God to give me clarity. What were my main topics? How do I choose? Where do I focus? And I really felt and sensed him saying, it's not what you write, it's why you write. What I write about is the common plagues of the heart. I write to let others know they are not alone in their struggles and that there is always hope. I realized that I had spent way too many years taking snapshots of everyone else's behavior and either judging it or trying to imitate it. It was time for me to turn that little camera back around on myself and take a snapshot of my own soul. And not a cleaned up soul selfie, but an unfiltered, raw, messy, and sometimes embarrassing soul selfie, the kind that suggests that I may have just rolled out of bed. So today I try to continue what I started. I write in my moments of pain and struggle and confess my shortcomings and my character defects in real time. I've found that it is far more effective to share with others and empowering to others when I share in the messy. I go first because when I talk about where I fall short and falter and fail, I can highlight how God is part of the drama and the trauma and the minutia of everyday life, how I integrate him into all of that. It's all part of my story and it all matters. Your story matters too. In the big deals and the little deals, it all counts. God does not waste any opportunity to use what we go through to help us know him better and help others do the same. So, you guys got study sheets? Anybody not get a study sheet? All right, cool. Oh, can someone help her get a study sheet? I think we have some more. There we go. So I want to spend the rest of our time unpacking some of the roadblocks that can prevent us from sharing our stories and the solutions that free us to do so. So if you need a pen, go find one. You can catch up. So the first one is the S. I was saying in the church that I spoke at this last weekend was one that I went to high school at and where I met my husband, and also where his father was the pastor. And if you have been here for a while, you might remember that my husband's father passed away from cancer last year. So it was such a privilege to be able to speak at his church. And I always say he would have been very proud of my outline because it spells selfie. And he was like the king of acrostics. He always had an acrostic in his sermon. So shout out to you, Ron Carter. So the first is S, silently suffer in your story versus share in the messiness of your story. Silently suffer in your story or share in the messiness of your story. I have done it both ways. I have countless journal entries documenting pain and suffering and anguish, whereas David in Psalms 22 says, my bones were out of joint, my heart has turned to wax, it has melted away within me. I wrote a blog about this one, it's called Boneless and Skinless. Has anyone ever felt like that? When I read those journal entries today, I scream at myself to help, to tell somebody, to get help, to break the silence. Talk to someone who might be suffering through the same. Today, I do it different. In fact, I might be accused of sharing TMI, too much information. But I'd rather risk the ramifications of vulnerable authenticity than live in protective, silent suffering. That helps no one. Sharing our story helps me, and it helps you. Everyone's story matters. A while back, I shared at a church in Southern California. The lovely leader, Kathy, reached out to me before I got there. She was just in a frenzy and excited. She had just watched the Passion play at her church. And this was the Easter story. And so one of the refrains she said throughout the play was, whenever Jesus did something amazing, which I'm sure was a lot, although sometimes he did a lot of walking, just walking and walking, a lot of nothing. She said someone would turn to Matthew and say, write that down, Matthew, write that down. Well, think about what our world would be like if he hadn't written that down. Wonder if we didn't know the story of Jesus because no one shared it. So let's make it more personal. Now, how will the world be different if you don't share your story? Now, I know you're already arguing, well, I'm not Jesus, so my story's not as good, but we have our own message to give to the world. And the most powerful messages are born out of our brokenness and how God is working in that. How has he shown up for you in some supernatural ways? Our tendency is to keep our suffering to ourselves. Maybe we were waiting to get all cleaned up before we're willing to go public. I used to do this as well. In my pre-cancer life, and especially when I was a pastor's wife for 20 years, I would share in hindsight. I used to share how I had been resentful of someone for a few months, and I took 3 simple steps, and ta-da, now I'm all better. But now, when resentment rears its ugly head, I go to my couch, pull out my iPad, and confess that I literally wanted to run that girl over with my car this morning when I dropped my kids off at school because she is so mean. I work through that resentment and my craziness on paper between me and God and me and you, and then I throw it out there for the world. Or I would sugarcoat my story and say things like, I'm just really struggling with being patient with my children. Instead of, the other day when I was so mad at my 3 kids that I sent them all to their rooms and then proceeded to throw down 2 24-count boxes of Go-Gurt, which exploded all over the living room and the kitchen and the ceiling and the cupboards. And that is a true confession. But do you see the difference? As a wise friend of mine always says, I don't have to live that way anymore. I regularly remind myself to share in the messy. I try to write the moment I'm having a character defect flare-up or outbreak. No one reads what I write or listens to me speak because I have it all together. They listen because I talk about my plagues of the heart, diseases like worry, fear, resentment, control in real time. Through a variety of suffering, I have learned that I'm not the only one battling this soul sickness. And unlike leukemia, these diseases of the soul are chronic. We will always struggle with something, but there's always hope that we can get better. One of the best ways to spur the process of healing is to help someone else. 2 Corinthians 1, 3, and 4 says this, Praise be to God, the Father of compassion and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. That's a mouthful, but let me just give you a little paraphrase that I use as my life verse. I use that as my life verse, but this is my paraphrase of it. We go through what we go through so we can help others get through what we went through. Yeah, you're going to want to write that down. We go through what we go through so we can help others get through what we went through. We don't have to be 100% over it in order to encourage someone else. When I look back on the first chapter of my first book, it's dated March 29th. I woke up in ICU and couldn't talk or walk or roll over on March 3rd. I didn't know if I would even live through leukemia at that point, but I wasn't going to waste time waiting around to find out. God had some things for me to say, and I was determined to share them and share in the sickness. I think one of the best stories that I have heard to illustrate this is from a podcast. Probably it wasn't a podcast then because it was a long time ago, whatever a speaker was when there's not a podcast. A guy was talking about how he was asked to fill in as a biology professor. Now, he had zero training on the subject, but they were desperate, so he agreed. He would literally study the lesson the night before, teach the topic the next day, and then go home and study for the next day's lesson. He learned brand new material every night and taught it the following day as if he'd known it for years. So one day, after class, a young, enamored student came up and just said, "You're just so knowledgeable and wise and smart. I just wish I knew as much about biology as you do." And he said he thought to himself, well, tomorrow you will. And I love that because that's really all God expects of us. You may not be cured, but you might be one day ahead of someone else struggling with parenting, enduring a loveless marriage, an addiction, a tough boss or a toxic coworker, an alien or wayward child. You don't need to have all the answers or even a solid belief that everything's going to be okay. You just need enough experience, strength, and hope to help someone get through today. Over time, they can learn to share this message with others. So I'll say it again. Everyone's story matters. Just because you don't have a cancer story or what you think is an exciting story, it doesn't mean your story shouldn't be told. It doesn't mean what you have gone through or what you're going through isn't impactful, encouraging, inspiring, or comforting to someone else. Whatever your disease is, Keep track of what's happening, how you feel about it, good or bad, and how you see God and his people showing up for you and your family. How are you letting God redeem it? Your story is important. Document it all, because you think you will never want to forget. You'll never forget this hard time, but you will. You think you don't ever want to talk about it again, but you need to. We need you to. But someone has to go first. Today it's me. I'll go first so you feel safe to go next. So your next little blank there is E, ego protective versus humbly surrendered. This is another roadblock to us being willing to share our stories. One of the biggest roadblocks is our ego. I've heard someone summarize this as edging God out. It's a sense of self-importance. Yeah, that one was ego protective versus humbly surrendered. It's a sense of self-importance that impedes our ability to share honestly and admit that we don't have it all together. Its main job is image management, and it is a big, endless job. I saw a t-shirt once that said, "What you think of me is none of my business." Indeed, it's not. I can relax and let God be in charge of that. Isn't that nice of me? So I have a couple stories to tell you about this. They are embarrassing but stellar examples of my personal battles with this character defect and its solution. Consider yourself warned. A few months ago, I was really struggling with putting out any videos on social media. The main problem, as I saw it, was I lacked the technical skills to do it. I could write a heartfelt blog in less time than it would take me to put a 30-second video out there. So I reached out to a friend. And before I even got there, I was feeling intimidated. Since she had an amazing social media presence, and I could barely figure out how to post anything, and was self-conscious and inadequate as I thought about doing it, I figured she might be able to help a girl out. So it started off casual, just going through my questions about social media, and gradually my inadequacies in the social media realm took a subtle then violent turn as I spewed, laid bare, splattered a plethora of insecurities and fears and worries that I had about writing, posting, and day-to-day living. It was like someone pulled a plug and all that had been stewing inside me, and now it was flowing freely, more like gushing. My friend listened patiently, but after a while, I noticed her eyes grew wider and wider, and her brows were raised, and in a combination of shock and information overload, she finally put up her hand and said, "I think you need to stop for a minute." What happened next was a type of miracle. In a way that no one has ever dared to do to me, she gently yet forcefully scared me straight. It went on for at least an hour. I lost track of time because I was stunned, but also acutely internalizing every word. With unconditional love, sincerity, and I'm not going to lie, a bit of terrifying passion, she said something like this: "Heather, who are you? What are you? Where are you? You have overcome leukemia and the family disease of addiction. You have survived betrayal of friends and started a new career and ended a 20-year ministry with no small bit of emotional extraction. You have written a book and are currently writing a second book. Yet everything coming out of your mouth at full speed suggests that you have allowed insecurity, codependency, doubt, comparison, and your ego to do a number on your thinking. You are getting in your own way. Being self-conscious of how you sound and look and are perceived on social media has immobilized you and stalled your message. There are people out there who need to hear that they are not alone in their struggles, and you are withholding hope as a result of your fear. It's clear that what you really need are a few days alone to get to the bottom of this. Reorient your mind and ponder what and who is driving your life. In other words, stop, get help, stat." So that story probably speaks for itself, but in case you need more evidence about how my ego gets in the way and how this blocks the vulnerability and willingness to share our stories, here's another one for your listening pleasure. So I have a distinct memory of a conversation I had with my husband several years ago. I had been with some good friends who I met with weekly, and it became clear to me when we were together one time that they all knew something about each other that I was not privy to. At first, I was angry and mouthy about it. I went home and spewed to my husband. Then my husband bravely suggested that maybe my feelings were actually hurt, to which I started crying. On a side note, crying is always better than rage to invoke compassion from a listener, just in case you were wondering. My husband's like, if you could just be soft, because I was like, ah. Once I started crying, then he's like, okay, I can help you with that. Otherwise, he was terrified. My husband asked me if I had ever shared some of my brokenness in a vulnerable way with them. Areas I had failed or struggled in. I had not. He said something next that was very wise and also very annoying. He said, you are going to have to choose between looking good to your friends and having true, honest friendships. I'm mortified to admit that I actually had to consider my answer. Did I really want them to see me as a messed up average girl? My ego at the time said no. I continued to hide and share just enough to stay connected, but not as intimately as they were with each other. But today, things are different. I am different. Today, not only do I share in the messy with those same friends, I share the real, raw, and messy me with new friends and thousands of other people in books and blogs, because I have learned that someone has to go first if we're going to cut through the facade of perfection and posturing. If you have ever felt that kind of loneliness, maybe today is the day that you stop letting your ego keep you from choosing to go first. So the next one is L, lack of identity versus identity in God. Lack of identity versus identity in God. This one is only the third one because it was L. It really should be the first one, and if we're going in order of priority. Lack of identity versus finding our identity in God. So when we don't know who we are, we succumb to the influences of others and end up living outside of who God made us to be. But even more hazardous to our hearts is that we depend on others to define us and help us and prevent us from feeling insecure, loved, and accepted. This is sometimes called codependency, which is just a mental health word for that very thing. The belief that I can't be okay unless you are okay, and also okay with me. So not only do you have to be okay and good in your world for me to feel okay, but you also have to everyone has to like me. Everyone has to be okay with me. That is what codependency is. And when I get sick in self and forget to remember that my identity should be rooted in only what God thinks of me, my life flies out of control and becomes unmanageable, at least in my head. It's virtually impossible to be open to sharing our story, shortcomings and all, when we're over-concerned about someone's reaction to them, when we're worried about what they will think of us, when we hold back our real selves to protect our reputation or control what someone thinks of us, we are giving them power to define us. Sometimes we hand over that power like we are passing the salt, without hardly a moment of hesitation or consideration. I remember listening to a tape of Tony Campolo, who was a speaker and author. I was in high school, so I'm figuring, I don't remember why, but I probably just got dumped or something. It was probably what it was. But I was listening to something that can maybe help me through it. And I remember him saying, whatever the most important person in your life thinks of you is what you will think of yourself. And if that person is anyone other than God, we are in danger of an identity crisis. In order to allow God to define us and help us live in light of His grace, we also have to be aware of and accepting of who we are, flaws and all. This is no small challenge. I'm going to read you a story that came to my mind as I was writing this. It helps me with at least one part of the solution, so just listen for a minute. A friend of mine was at a crossroads to continue drinking or get herself to an AA meeting and start the sobriety journey again. She made a decision. She would stop. Today was the beginning of a new life of freedom from addiction. She was ready until her phone rang. A friend asked her to go out for a drink, and she declined, telling them that she had quit drinking. They cajoled her and said, okay, that's great. You can just drink beer. So she went. As she sat at the bar, being overtaken by and powerless against alcohol, she loudly proclaimed her strong feelings about the worthlessness of AA. And soon, the bearded, burly, tattooed bartender, biker, the only kind of angel that God could have sent that girl to get her attention, made his way down the row of customers. He politely but intentionally slapped down his sobriety coin right in front of her and gently invited her to look into an AA meeting. The next day, as she lay on the floor feeling defeated and desperate, she heard a quiet voice that she believes was God saying, "Get up and go to a meeting. I am whispering this now. Don't make me yell." So she did. After the meeting, they circled around for the closing prayer. As she grabbed the hand of the man next to her, she looked up and met eyes with the bartender. And here is where I make my point. He looked down at her and said, "Well, there you are." She knew this was indeed a new beginning. She responded, "Here I am." I love this image so much because we are all in there somewhere. God is saying to you, where are you? We need to respond, "Here I am." But sometimes it's easier than others to peel back the outside stuff that keeps us from our center, from establishing an identity that is not dependent on anyone outside of us and God. We get fixated on our past mistakes or character defects and convince ourselves that we're not worthy, we're not cleaned up enough, we're not strong, pure, stable, consistent, patient, godly, wise enough to be worth listening to. I wrote a blog last year called "You Are Not It," capital I, capital T. After hearing pastor and author Stephen Furtick mention this idea in a message I was listening to on YouTube while curling my hair. So it takes me so long to curl my hair, because there's a lot of it, that I just can't stand to do only that. Like, this is a waste of life right here. So I always put on, usually it's Stephen Furtick. I sit in my living room and put on this guy and listen to his messages. They kind of remind me of like a male version of me, so I don't know, maybe that's where I get some of my stuff. So anyway, I'm pretty sure that It is one of the scariest movies ever. The movie It by Stephen King is about a demonic clown who terrorizes a group of kids. Nice, huh? Just watching the previews is enough to give me nightmares, and to be honest, that's the only part of that movie I've ever watched because I'm scared of scary movies. So I had to Google the plot and was surprised that the point of the movie was not just to cause even adults to sleep with the lights on or do a quick check under their bed before they hop into bed, hit the pillow at night. The It is actually a physical representation of their individual worst fears. It stalks and even kills a few of the kids throughout the movie. In my Soul Selfie book, there are a few plagues of the heart that I revisit regularly. I've mentioned the chronic diseases of the soul, like worry, fear, jealousy, resentment, image management, control. Those things seem to haunt me. I think it would be safe to define those as an It, in the same way the It's in our life seek to steal, kill, and destroy us. If you take nothing else away from what I say today, please, please, please remember, you are not it. Regardless of what haunts you, you are not it. You are not defined by your character defects or your fears or your past mistakes. It may rear its ugly head now and then, but it is not who you are. Don't let it do what it did in the movies, drag you down into the sewer and terrorize or kill you. I love how Corey Asbury puts it in a song that's been rolling around in my head for a few weeks. He says, "Failure won't define us because that's what my Father does." Feel free to substitute your failure with whatever shortcomings or sins you battle. Whatever is keeping you from telling your story, if you're anything like me, you might have a pretty steady rotation of behaviors or attitudes that you could use to fill in that blank. But God has a different plan. God wants to redeem it. In this life, we may not ever be 100% over it, but we can surrender it, invite God into it, trusting that He can work all things out for good and the good of others if we let Him, according to Romans 8:28. So F, fear of our secrets versus freedom from our secrets. Fear of our secrets versus freedom from our secrets. Don't you feel like I'm just getting all up in your business today? Because boy, these are some tough topics. A couple of summers ago, I read a book. It was in August. I was laying on this fake beach in downtown Chicago while my daughter and her friends were at Lollapalooza. And this, for a 50-year-old who had almost fully raised her 3 children and survived cancer, packs all the fun and excitement that I need to thoroughly enjoy myself. Of course, I was reading some heavy content. You're going to think I'm obsessed with Stephen King, but honestly, I don't ever watch his movies, except if you watched like Stand By Me and The Green Mile. He actually has some really good ones out there, but I don't watch horror movies. But this was a book my friend had given me. I read all 164 wide space pages in 2 whole days. So let me give you the sentence from this book that spoke to me about secrets. Secrets are a problem. Maybe the biggest problem of all. They weigh on the mind and take up space in the world. Gwendy, in the book, has this thought about secrets as she becomes aware of the tremendous pressures she lives with after being given a box covered with buttons that hold power to control her immediate surroundings and even events on the other side of the world. She has to keep it safe from others who might find it and use it for evil, as well as to keep it safe from her own whims and fancies and resentment fantasies. She's been given strict instructions by the giver not to let anyone know about the box. It becomes a veritable weight, a constant burden and distraction as she goes about her life, trying to look and act normal. She's ever mindful, even as she dates, succeeds in sports and life, of her box and its safety, always worrying that someone might find it, or telling tales to her loved ones about where she's going so they won't know that she's checking on her box. The secret consumes her every thought. So take a moment to think of your box, your biggest secret, your biggest, darkest, scariest secret. Does it weigh on your mind and take up space in the world? It probably won't take you long to identify it, because it's always just right there. Even when you think you're fooling others, you're not fooling yourself. And it's slowly crushing you, robbing you of freedom and joy, causing you to be imprisoned by the fear that someone might figure out your hiding spot. You can't let people too close, because if you slip up or are vulnerable, they might figure out where the hiding place is. You've imagined it over and over, the potential outcome if this should happen. People might think you're an ogre, a hypocrite, a monster, a victim, someone unlovable, disgusting, unredeemable, unforgivable, unworthy. They might reject or shame you. These possibilities keep your resolve to hide it in strong force. You protect it at all cost, and the cost is pretty high. What reignited my thoughts on this topic was an event my husband took us to not long after I read this book. I thought more people were aware of this New York Times bestseller. It's by Frank Warren. He wrote a book called Post-Secret. A fun fact I learned about Frank Warren is apparently he grew up in Springfield. I've had this coffee table book on my coffee table for probably 15 years by now, way before, and I think I actually had it longer than that because it was before I even moved to Springfield that we had this book. So here's the premise. In 2004, he passed out postcards to strangers with his home address on them, inviting them to share a secret. The only rules were that it had to be true, it had to be something they had never shared with anyone before, and it was anonymous. After the first week, he posted a few of them online and had 1,000 views. After week 2, he posted and had 10,000 views. After week 3, there were 100,000 viewers, and the rest is history. Today, he has millions of postcards literally stacked to the ceiling in one room of his house. I attended this event the night before I was to do a talk with about 50 local businesswomen. It reinforced what I say and why I write, and that it's not only necessary for me, but for countless others who have often thought I am the only one. The despair that comes from feeling like we're alone in our brokenness, our pain, our secrets is crushing. It causes mental and physical illness, loneliness, and even death in our churches, our schools, our towns, and in our country every single day. When we have secrets and keep them, we slowly deteriorate. In recovery program, there's a saying that says, we are only as sick as our secrets. You cannot work the 12 steps successfully without passing through the steps that help you puke that junk out and let someone love you in spite of it. We have to reveal our secrets to God, which is kind of redundant since I believe he already knows our every thought. Ourselves, which means we have to be alone with ourselves once in a while to reflect, and to another person, the key to freedom and release. Frank Warren continues to offer hope by giving people this same opportunity. He says, secrets have stories. They can also offer truths. After seeing thousands of secrets, I understand that sometimes when we believe we are keeping a secret, the secret is actually keeping us. And at the end of this event, he opened up 2 microphones and invited people to come and share their post-secret live. The lines were curled around the corners, and at one point he had to cut the confessions off for the sake of time. People were brave and cried and hugged perfect strangers and often their best friends who they had kept the secret from. That's the reality of our world. Even though some of us have what we consider a best friend, we are still in hiding and living in shame and fear, always trying to figure out the safest hiding place for our secret. So maybe today is the day of freedom for you, or at least the beginning of it. Maybe you could start by sharing it with Frank Warren in a post-secret. But eventually, I think sharing it with a person with skin on who can say to you, you're not the only one, and that you're still worthy of love, will give you the most freedom. There's one caveat to this, though. You have to be discerning about who that person is and what you're sharing. Discretion is important, as well as the potential impact on the other person. Unloading a burden of your secret onto someone else who might be devastated by it is not loving or wise. So pray about it, seek counsel. Your goal must be for you to be free, but not at the expense of putting someone else into captivity. So I want to close this section out by sharing a quote from Bill Wilson, who's the founder of the recovery movement. I practically have it memorized because I think it applies to anyone willing to expose the darkest places of their past in order to bring light and warmth to their present. He says, we should be only too willing to bring former mistakes, no matter how grievous, out of their hiding places. Showing others who suffer how we were given help is the very thing that makes life seem worthwhile to us now. Cling to the thought that in God's hands, the dark past is the greatest possession we have, the key to life and happiness for others. With it, you can avert death and misery for them, and for ourselves, I might add. So let's ask ourselves, will we share in the messiness and freely and let God redeem it? Or will we keep secrets that keep us and others captive? The next one is isolation from real relationships versus involvement in authentic relationships. Isolation from real relationships versus involvement in authentic relationships. A while back, I watched the movie 127 Hours with my son Bennett. It's about a hiker who gets trapped in the canyon for 127 hours. It's with the actor James Franco. So with his hand, at one point, he goes hiking, and his hand is pinned between a giant rock and the canyon wall. So I rented it a few years ago by myself, but I must admit that I watched it probably like this, with my fingers. Oh, that's making not good noises. So I watched this whole hour-and-a-half movie in probably 40 minutes, because I fast-forwarded a lot of it. I mean, when you know that he's going to eventually, spoiler alert, drink his own urine and saw off his own arm, kind of makes you want to just keep fast-forwarding things. But it's unbearable to watch everything leading up to that. But this time I was being tough, and I watched the whole thing through the cracks of my fingers. And I have to tell you that by the end, I found myself choking back tears. Evidently, I lost a bit of the relief and celebration of the movie when I watched it through my fingers. So I realized about halfway through, because I was actually listening to all the parts, that this was about the dangers of isolation, or the importance of community. At one point, while his hand is wedged between the rock and the canyon wall, he is videotaping himself, and he basically talks about how sorry he is that he hadn't called his mom back, which he should be, and how he hadn't returned her call from the night before, and how, in trying to appear like a superhero, he had told no one where he was going. He laments that this rock has been here my whole life. It's been waiting for me. I did this to myself. When he finally saws himself free and comes across some other hikers, they zoom in on him yelling, "Help, help, I need help," saying this over and over and over. It's a great story about how much we need each other. We were designed for companionship. At the time, isolation feels cool, confident, and safe. Boy, have I been wedged by that rock. I distinctly remember a discussion I had with God about why in the world he would let me get my real estate license when he knew I was going to have leukemia 2 weeks later and 2 months later and be unable to work for the next 8 months. He gave me a wonderful answer. All of a sudden, I realized that part of the point was in preparing to sell houses, it forced me out of my isolation and back into a community I had been hiding from. Prior to launching my career, my managing broker suggested that we write 100 handwritten letters to friends and family, telling them what we were doing. So I used it as an opportunity to reconnect with people who I had not been in touch with for a long, long time. It was scary, but healing for me, and I hope for them. I also got on Facebook with much arm twisting for the first time. I was able to reconnect with hundreds of people who I had isolated myself from for a couple years after my husband and I had left a position at our church of 20 years. By the time I got leukemia, it was a natural thing for me to reach out to those hundreds of people that I had reconnected with. Isolation is safe, but also dangerous, lonely, and unfulfilling. I'm so grateful that my life brought about circumstances that forced me to risk pursuing community and come out of hiding, because we all need help. So some of you might be feeling pretty confident and even a bit smug right now because you actually have play dates with other women every week, which I would tell you is a good start. But there's more to intimacy than getting together with other women and catching up about kids, vacations, jobs, etc. Remember my story a few points back. It even goes beyond, dare I say, being in a group designed to connect you. We have to be intentional and vulnerable if we want to have a real impact on others and allow others to have a real impact on our lives. So I go to a regular meeting where the leader for the week can bring any topic they want to the table. They read something about acceptance, forgiveness, control, etc. And then as we go around the room, each person shares on that topic. So one time the topic was staying on topic and how important that was. It helps people get the most out of the meeting. This person's share was beautiful and convicting, and I just wanted to stand up and applaud. It was just spot on about how important it is to stay on the topic. And then, I kid you not, the very next person that spoke started talking about her pets. And that's all she talked about for the next 5 minutes, were her pets. I was stunned, and also at the same time kind of felt like bursting out laughing at the irony of this situation. Don't be that girl. Know your topic and stay on it. And the best way to do this is to define and remember your topics. Will you go down that political rabbit hole of complaining, or will you steer the conversation towards how God is in control? That's a good one for this last week. Will you complain about your life, or talk about the good things happening, or how God is working in the things that appear bad? Will you bash your family member who rubs you wrong and never helps clean up after family get-togethers? Or will you share how you're grateful that you have a family to get together with? You get the idea. What is the dominant topic of your life? Find it and stay on it. Authentic relationships don't just typically happen. At one point or another, someone makes the choice to go first, to share that your marriage is fragile and precarious, that your child is addicted or said she hates you and wants to move out. These aren't first date type of conversations, but eventually you have to be brave enough to cross that line. That doesn't mean that every single conversation you have is deep and hard and ends in crying and hugging and singing Kumbaya together. Just be mindful of the connection you're making with people. Do they feel free and safe to share what they're going through, or that they're having a hard time battling with behaviors that are threatening their family, their faith, their marriage, or their very soul? Several years ago, before I was at the end of myself, my husband and I were in a study group with several couples. We'd been meeting for a few months when I went out with one of the women alone. We chatted for a bit and the topic of marriage came up, and I asked her what hers was like. She said, "Actually, we're thinking about getting a divorce." And they did. Now, I'm not blaming the group or myself for this, but I most definitely take responsibility for creating an environment where, as a leader, I failed to model what it was to be open and vulnerable with my real problems, in my own marriage, in my own dark thoughts, in my doubting heart and my ugly feelings. I don't know if sharing those things or those secrets that I kept to be a good example and maintain a certain reputation would have helped her or their marriage, but I do know this: not sharing them harmed everyone, including me. It contributed to my living in denial and duplicity and left no room for hope or aspirations of ever having relief or making progress in defeating such flaws. My battles remained my own. They kept me lonely and helped no one. As a result, I lived in shame and fear of being found out, though I am pretty sure people around me already suspected that I wasn't perfect. I also left no room for God to use my defects and mistakes and redeem them by giving courage, strength, and hope to someone else who might need to know that they are not the only one. I love what author Glennon Doyle Melton says about her relationships with friends and people she has known for years. We've spent our time together talking about everything but what matters. We never brought to each other the heavy things we were meant to help each other carry. We've only introduced ourselves to our representatives, while our real selves tried to live life alone. We thought that was safer. We thought that this way our real selves wouldn't get hurt. It became clear that we were all hurting anyway. I'm not thrilled that some 15 years after my small group leadership career has ended that I can say I have been through the ringer with pain and loss and grief and the family disease of addiction and cancer, but I can't say that I regret what God has done in me as a result. Like the Velveteen Rabbit or Pinocchio, I finally became real, able to be ever so slightly vulnerable. On most days, when I'm emotionally and spiritually aware and healthy, I care more about how my story can be used for good than what you think of me as a result of hearing it. I devote significant time and self-talk and prayer to remind myself how to bring the inside me to the outside, to avoid sending a representative in my place. This is my living amends for the years of trying to be shiny on the outside and withholding the shattered on the inside. Lord, give us the courage to be ourselves. And then our final letter, E, exhausting comparison versus resting contentment. Exhausting comparison versus resting contentment. So just a funny little story to kick off this little topic of comparison. So every once in a while, I read my own book. I know that sounds a little weird, but when I start to forget what I know I believe, it recalibrates my heart and my mind and helps me stay the course and focus on my core mission, to share my story and help others and help them find hope and healing in theirs. So one time I was reading a few chapters, and about partway through I started thinking, man, this is good stuff. You know, if I could be this girl, if I could be as smart and mature and wise as this girl, I will have arrived. And when it occurred to me that I was reading my own words, I thought, when you compare yourself with yourself and you're still not good enough, you may have a serious problem. So even when we establish our identity in God, there is a subtle yet persistent pull to compare ourselves to others. And if you're extra sick like me, even to yourself. And we don't just compare ourselves, we compare everything we hold dear. Our kids, our family, our spouses, our homes, sometimes even our church. I've been aware of this comparison monster for a while. It's usually a subtle underlying issue for me, but recently it has been rearing its ugly head. In a conversation I had with a coworker and a friend of mine not too long ago, I was whining about why I wasn't selling. It was for my job, so why I wasn't selling enough, and it was just on and on about all the ways I was comparing myself. And she said, she's kind of a blunt person, which I love and I'm also a little bit scared of. She said, and this is a different friend, not the other scary friend, a couple of those, but she said, Heather, you have got to stop comparing yourself to others. It's going to kill you. Comparison destroys at its most basic macro level of camaraderie. Church, work, classrooms, social circles, etc. When I'm always evaluating whether I am better than or less than someone else, it's impossible to connect at any kind of non-threatening level. I'm either the intimidator or the intimidated. Comparing myself to others leads to a constant state of jealousy, resulting in lack of celebration for the successes of others. If I'm jealous or wanting what someone else has, I resent them. In a book called Courage to Change, it says, envy is just a hostile form of self-pity. When I want what you have, or think I deserve it, but I'm not getting it, it leads to ingratitude and puts a wedge between you and me. There's no chance of cultivating a healthy community when I compare. Doing so leads to ladder living, where we are always above somebody or below somebody. It's an exhausting, anxious way to live. So comparison also kills companionship. On a micro level, comparing myself with others assures my loneliness. I isolate from my friends and from others if I can't handle hearing how good they have it, or I'm afraid to share how I struggle. Having authentic relationships with my friends and family will never happen if my number one goal is image management, preventing you from knowing the real me, so I can keep up the facade of being okay. I will say that I have made a little progress in this area. The relationships that I have with people now versus when I was a pastor's wife with a nicely packaged little family are ever so much better than they were before. Most of the changes, in my opinion, came as a result of sharing in the ugly. It didn't happen because I got more spiritual or skinny or successful. It happened because I lost my body and my hair and my church and some friends and sometimes my mind. Then I shared it with the world. People who didn't used to like me very much liked me more. Friends who felt different from me realized I was a mess and loved me more intimately than they did before. When the subtle sin of wanting to be seen and seem better than others ruled my life, my relationships were shallow and guarded. It put a wall between me and those I cared about. Comparison creates competition, except in this case, when you win, you lose. Comparison also kills contentment. This is perhaps the most dangerous kill of all. When I am constantly comparing myself, my body, my job, my kids, my spouse, my vacations, my activities, my popularity, my finances, my successes and failures, my soul cannot rest. When I compare what God has for me with what God has set in place for other people, my spirit is discontent. This discontent activates some of my other signature sins like worry, fear, pride, resentment, control. There are no benefits that come from the disease of comparison. Now let's talk for a minute about some solution, because I truly need this reminder. As I said earlier, this is not new information for me. It's stuff I already know or say I believe, but in practicality, I struggle to implement. The remedy is obvious in many ways, but it's easy to do, easy not to do. I liken it to dieting. I mean, everybody knows what to eat and what not to eat. I mean, let's not pretend that we don't know that a McDonald's Happy Meal and a Diet Coke is not the same as having fruits and vegetables and a nice glass of water. The hard part is not in the knowing, it's in the doing. It reminds me of Paul's rant in Philippians 7. He says, I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing. Anyone relate to that? I desperately don't want to compare myself, but the force is strong in me, people. It keeps pulling at me. The absolute only way I've ever found to give me relief is to find my completeness in God. And I do this in a few ways. By letting what God thinks of me, like we talked about before, letting what God thinks of me determine how I feel about myself. Trusting that his plan or path for me is perfect and has nothing to do with the plan or path that he has designed for you. In order to do this, I have to regularly, and by that I mean about 70,000 times a day, because me and Paul are kind of a hot mess, remind myself that my identity comes from God alone, and what he thinks of me is the only voice that matters. Not mine, not yours, not the made-up voice that I have put in your head about me. None of it matters. Only what the voice of truth says to me should affect my serenity. And just in case you're unsure of what God thinks of you, from what I've experienced, observed around me, and read in the Bible, he is smitten. He adores you. And unlike regular people, he loves you even when you're rotten. He pursues you and gets you like no one else does. He loves you without condition or performance, good or bad, without limits or timelines. He longs for you to love him back, not because he's a desperate being, but because he is desperate for you to embrace his affections, his guidance, his will, his grace. I have to continually surrender my will and those selfish and short-sighted desires that tend to dominate my thoughts to God, and trust that his will always turns out best, even if it doesn't feel good at the moment. I have to practice what speaker and author Kay Warren refers to as the witty principle, W-I-T-T-Y, the witty principle. What is that to you? In other words, what other people do and think is none of my business, because God has me on a special Heather-designed road that belongs only to me, and I need to stay in my lane and out of yours if I want to be content in my spirit. Comparing the potholes of freshly paved surface of our individual roads, or the freshly paved surfaces of our individual roads, will kill us and steal our joy. I'm feeling like this material of comparison could really take up an entire day. If you've noticed, that's kind of the buzzword when you go to, I guess we don't have any Christian bookstores anymore, but when you're looking for Christian books, this is something that's starting to rear its head and be addressed by a lot of people. I unfortunately have had this disease for a very long time, so in some ways I'm ahead of that, but the solution is popping up more and more around us. But we could talk about all of these really all day, but we're not going to, because now you're starting to do what I told you, like, Heather, play the quiet game by yourself. But for now, let's just agree to practice these principles as in all we do and see how God shows up. So, there you have it. I've encouraged you to keep this selfie guide handy, review it regularly, and ask God to remove those roadblocks that keep you from taking a raw, #no-filter selfie and sharing it with those God brings your way. Embrace your story and use it for God's glory. Let's pray together. God, I know you have spoken to these women today through me. I know that you've given us all a message that we can take away and implement in our lives. Help us not to walk away and forget what we've heard. Help us to hear your voice about how much you cherish us and how you want to use our story to empower and encourage and give comfort to others who are going through the same. Help us not keep it to ourselves because we're afraid of how we'll look, what people will think about us. Help us to be willing to go first. We love you and thank you for this morning, and ask that you'll continue to speak to us as we move into the next little section. We pray these things in your name. Amen. Okay, so let me give you a couple instructions as we go. What we're going to do is go into the next room, and there's some food. You can grab it and then find a spot at a table. Try to get at least 4 or 5 people to a table. We don't want to just like 2 people at one table because we're going to do some discussion. And then when we get in there, I'll give you some more bossy instructions, all right? Okay, break.